Mic check, 1, 2, 3. Dexter, malinaw ba?
Yes, sir. Malinaw
Okay.
naman.
Okay, sige.
Alright.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Sige po. Thank you.
everyone, a pleasant afternoon. On behalf of the Ateneo de Manila University School of Government and Project Participate, we welcome you to the third leg of Halalan 2.0, holding free, fair, and safe elections in the new normal. Before we start, please be reminded of a few etiquettes to observe during the event. To help keep background noise to a minimum, please make sure you mute your microphone and turn off your video cameras during the presentation and when you are not speaking. If you have any questions, we will be having an open forum after the presentation. You may use the Q&A button found on the Zoom toolbar or send a direct private message to the organizers, Mr. Dexter Yang and or Mr. Jazz Malonda. Lastly, feel free to use the chat box to share your thoughts or opinions on the matter being discussed. Please be advised to observe courtesy and respect in the conversation. Bullying of any kind is not allowed, and disrespectful comments will not be tolerated. Any violation of the first warning will merit an automatic eviction from the webinar. Self-promotion, spam, and irrelevant links are also not allowed. We invite everyone to follow our social media accounts on facebook.com/AteneoOSOG, facebook.com/participateph, follow us on Twitter at @participate_ph, and Instagram at @participate_ph. As we begin our webinar, we are proud to introduce our guest host and moderator for our session today. Our guest moderator is a political journalist and an educator who hosts the daily political talk program, Matters of Fact, on the ABS-CBN News Channel. He also hosts a weekly podcast called Facts First, and he began his career with the Philippine Daily Inquirer, then joined ABS-CBN as a news correspondent and anchor. He also teaches political reporting and journalism ethics at the University of Santo Tomas. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Mr. Christian Esguerra.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Now to all our guests and audience from the Philippines and abroad, and on behalf of the Ateneo School of Government, we welcome you to the third leg of the Halalan 2.0, holding free, fair, and safe elections in the new normal. Now, this is a third in a series of webinars that will tackle how various countries have managed to conduct their elections amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, for countries like the Philippines that are preparing for the national elections next year, it will be critical to start preparations in earnest to protect democratic processes. Now, the Halalan 2.0 webinar series aims to gather insights from election experts and discuss international best practices of conducting elections amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, knowledge gathered from these webinar sessions, together with research, shall be used to produce a manual that will recommend safety measures and estimate the cost of COVID-19 proofing our 2022 elections. Now, to formally begin our webinar, may we call on the president of the Strat-based ADR Institute, Professor Victor Dindo Manhit, to give us his opening remarks. Let us all give him a virtual round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Halalan 2.0. I take this opportunity to thank the organizers, to thank all participants in this webinar that focuses on holding free, fair, and safe elections. You know, when we started last year, as we got challenged by this health crisis, this continuing health crisis, something that really brought about a key area of our concern was really how it will affect democracy in the Philippines. So in one of my key commentaries, I shared in one of our roundtable in the ADR Institute, I spoke of the need for government and civil society to be accountable and ensure safety, broad participation, and credibility in any electoral exercises. I argue that despite COVID-19, election must go on. We must do our best to prevent any regression or backsliding from the gains and performance of the 2019 election. And we should use this opportunity in 2021 to learn from the experiences of other countries, to learn and build on what we can learn from it, and really prepare ourselves for the 2022 national elections. Especially that the Philippines, there's a lot of interest. A study done by Pulse Asia, published last December, identified at least 88% of Filipinos are very interested in the coming May 2022 elections. And they are registered voters. So some, because of the change of age maybe, are still willing to register. So we see this opportunity really for democracy to work, even in this new normal of COVID, brought about by COVID-19. That's why in Democracy Watch, one of our projects in the Strat-based ADR Institute, we commissioned a study right after the 2019 election and see where the Philippines, what are the views of the general public of Filipinos with regards to the electoral or the polling system that we have. And we saw this 84% trust and a 91% ratings of Filipinos in favor of continuous use of automated elections. And I'd like to share this data. We have tracked this since automation happened, since I think 2010, and we just wanted to share the results of our partnership with Pulse Asia. Something that we need to take note. There's so much noise about this lack of trust in the election process that they even want to change again the process of voting. But it sees how we keep on improving from 74% in 2016 to 84% in 2019. More so in the use of an automated election, something that in Strat-based ADR Institute and in our Democracy Watch project, we continue to advocate because our fear of retail and wholesale cheating brought about by manual voting. So we see this legitimacy of the electoral process in the Philippines, and we just hope that now as we deal with a bigger problem of health vis-a-vis with elections, we focus more on how do we ensure that even in a pandemic, even if we have a successful vaccination program before the 2022 national election, we will take note of health and the legitimacy of the electoral process. As I've said, there might be a dilemma between health and pushing through with elections, but both needs can be addressed by a whole of society approach. Learning from experiences of other countries, civil society working with government, election administrators like the Commonwealth, working with the security forces of our society to ensure peaceful, credible elections in 2022. That's why at the start of this year, I wrote in my first commentary in the Philippine Daily Inquirer, which I titled Political Integrity in Public Interest for 2021. I argue that the outbreak of COVID-19 has become a societal emergency that even challenges the overall operations of the state. But we in our institute believe that the societal emergency, such as this, demands a whole of society approach. As we face the 2022 elections, we must do our part. We need to coordinate, we need to cooperate, response to ensure that we will have a credible 2022 national election. As I've said, learning from the experiences of other countries, building on it, and ensuring a credible, legitimate result of the 2022 national elections in the Philippines. Again, thank you. Welcome, and let's hope that we can learn a lot as we discuss in this webinar this afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Manhit, for that message. Now, as we begin our session today, let's first go over our program and a few reminders for our audience. Number one, first resource speakers will be given 20 minutes to deliver their presentation. Now, to reduce intervals in between presentations, the organizers may present the speaker's PowerPoint presentations during the webinar. Of course, after the resource speakers, there will be a short discussion with invited reactors to be followed by an open forum with the participants. Now, for our audience, please direct your questions to the Q&A box, which is found at the bottom of your monitor. Please make your questions brief and straight to the point and address it to whoever you'd like to direct your answer. Due to time considerations, the organizers may select only a number of questions from the audience. We also encourage our audience watching via our live stream at the Ateneo School of Government Facebook page to leave their comments there. We invite everyone to post or tweet about our webinar today using hashtags Let's Vote In and COVID-Free Halalan Webinar Series. Okay, now without further ado, may I introduce our session's first speaker for today. He is a program officer in the Electoral Processes Program of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, where he manages its global overview of COVID-19 impact on elections project. His other focus areas include electoral risk management, financing of elections, and training in electoral administration with an emphasis on bridge and electoral training facilities. He worked as the ACE Electoral Knowledge Network Coordinator from 2015 until 2016. He has worked directly with over 24 election management bodies and civil society groups in Latin America, Africa, Europe, Asia on various electoral capacity development projects. Ladies and gentlemen, to discuss financing the elections under COVID-19, let us welcome Mr. Erik Asplund.
My name is Erik Asplund, and I'm a program officer at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, also known as International IDEA. The Institute is an intergovernmental organization with 33 member states that support sustainable democracy worldwide. International IDEA is based in Stockholm, Sweden, but has offices around the globe, including Australia, Bolivia, Bhutan, Ethiopia, and Panama. My presentation today will focus on findings from International IDEA's Global Overview project, with an emphasis on health and safety measures, special voting arrangements, and associated costs of elections during the pandemic. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Ateneo School of Government and partner institutions for inviting me to speak to you today through this pre-recorded video. Based on our Global Overview report, between 21st of February 2020 up until the 1st of February 2021, at least 105 countries and territories across the globe have held national or sub-national elections. There are still postponements, like in Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada last week, but they are much less frequent compared to last year. Almost all countries that have held national elections in 2020 have adopted health and safety measures for polling stations. This typically includes a combination of rules on social distancing, the use of hand washing facilities or hand sanitizers, ventilation of the polling station, the cleaning of voting materials, and personal protective equipment for polling officials. Beyond these general measures, many countries introduced innovative and extraordinary measures to decrease infection risk. These measures are typically country and election specific, which may have been exacerbated by spikes in the coronavirus. For example, in Bermuda, Jamaica, and Singapore, the Election Commission introduced temperature checks for voters entering into polling stations. In Bolivia, New Zealand, and South Korea, the Election Commission decided to open more polling stations compared to previous elections. Other extraordinary measures include extending working hours for polling station staff, increasing the size of polling stations in order to ensure social distancing, organizing mock polling stations to simulate election day, and employing so-called COVID-19 ambassadors to manage compliance with safety measures outside and inside polling stations. Beyond health and safety measures, many countries have modified special voting arrangements to reduce crowds and implement social distancing on election day, thereby reducing the risk of infection. Other reasons special voting arrangements have been expanded include ensuring access for vulnerable groups and allowing people already with COVID-19 or in quarantine to vote. Special voting arrangements include early voting, postal voting, proxy voting, home and institutional-based voting by mobile ballot box, and COVID-19 arrangements in polling stations. Many countries that held elections in 2020 used early voting arrangements which were already available before the pandemic. Several countries expanded these early voting arrangements to reduce crowding on election day. For example, in South Korea, the EMB extended the period of voting to regulate voter flows. As a result, 27% of voters voted early compared to 12% in the 2016 parliamentary election. Similarly, New Zealand, which also expanded early voting, saw an increase in early voting by 37% compared to the 2017 election and by 64% compared to the 2014 election. Some countries altered existing early voting arrangements for people in quarantine or infected by COVID-19. In Bermuda, advanced voting provisions had already been made available to voters under the law. However, last year it was also extended to voters with COVID-19. Similar provisions have been made in Trinidad and Tobago. Early voting was also facilitated by so-called drive-by or drive-through voting made available for people with COVID-19 or self-isolating in Lithuania. Home and institutional-based voting arrangements by mobile ballot box were widely used for homebound and people in quarantine or infected by COVID-19. Many countries such as Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia extended existing provisions to accommodate those affected by COVID-19. For example, in Montenegro, the EMB granted hospitalized patients the right to vote through mobile ballot box teams. Primarily because of costs related to health and safety measures and special voting arrangements, the costs of holding elections during the pandemic are significantly rising. In June 2020, Toby James, Alistair Clark, and I published an article that focused on the rising costs of elections during the beginning of the pandemic. In all of the 8 countries that we looked at, the additional cost per voter was expected to increase. The additional costs cited included the purchasing of personal protective equipment, such as face shields, medical gloves, and protective clothing for polling officials, and sometimes masks and gloves for voters. The purchasing of hand sanitizers, sanitizing tissues, contactless thermometers, pens, plexiglass screens also increased event costs. Many of the health and safety measures and special voting arrangements that I mentioned earlier were also cited by country officials, namely the cost of extra staff, facilities, and materials. South Korea provides an example that has already held elections during the pandemic from which we can draw considerable lessons. In April 2020, its National Election Commission organized a parliamentary election that resulted in an historic high 66% voter turnout. The Commission implemented a range of health and safety measures and expanded early voting arrangements in order to allow a larger number of people to vote before Election Day, irrespective of their residence. Preliminary estimates suggest that the cost of the parliamentary national election was approximately 226 billion Korean won, or 189 million US dollars, compared with the 203 billion Korean won, or 170 million US dollars for the 2016 parliamentary election. The increased costs were attributed to 1. Inflation, 2. An increase of eligible voters from 42 million to 43 million, and 3. Measures related to COVID-19, in particular personal protective equipment. COVID-19 measures alone came to 20 billion Korean won for 16 million US dollars, which equates to approximately 9% of the total election costs. In the end, health and safety measures and associated costs will depend on the country and election context, but without sufficient intervention and to reassure voters, turnout could be hit, especially among those with underlying health conditions. Evidence shows that there is a positive relationship between resourcing and election quality. Better run elections are often those which are better resourced. Studies from the UK, the US, and comparative research has established this link. When funding is cut, election quality is cut. Healthy and fair elections therefore require investment. With that, I would like to thank you, the audience, and the Ateneo School of Government, and all partner institutions for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Before I leave, I just wanted to mention that all of International Idea's resources on election and COVID are publicly available on our website. This includes in-depth case studies developed in partnership with the Electoral Integrity Project on elections held during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asplund, for your presentation. Now, at this point, we turn the floor over to our reactors who will discuss Singapore's election experience and the roles of various stakeholders, such as civil society, the academe, and media during elections under COVID-19. Our second guest speaker is currently a visiting senior research fellow at Penang Institute in Malaysia, working on socio-economic and socio-political issues. She has worked as a teacher, journalist, researcher, director of programs in gender, business and human rights, advocacy and communications. She has been directly involved and has led organizations working on free and fair elections, gender equality, migrant workers, and human rights, among others. She has published papers, book chapters, articles, and also written reports to and for organizations that include think tanks in Southeast Asia and to the United Nations. She is also the secretary of MARUAH, a human rights NGO that monitors Singapore's elections and was a nominated member of parliament in Singapore. Let us all welcome Ms. Braema Mathi.
Hello. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me. And I have put up my PowerPoint presentation. I think everyone can see that. Am I right? So I will begin. And I appreciate what Mr. Erik and Prof. Dindo have shared, because I think this is the next extension following up what they have already shared. So I'm just trying to see why it doesn't go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, we have a technical. Why doesn't it go to the next slide? Does anyone know that? I'm pressing the buttons and it doesn't go to the next slide. Hello, can you all hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
But do you know how I can move it? Can you see my first slide?
What appears on screen is your slide, which says elections and the pandemic. What can be done?
Thank you very much. But I'm pressing the button to go to the next slide and it doesn't want to go. Can the technical crew help me and move it to the next slide?
Okay. We'll ask him to get.
Sorry about this, because we did practice this and it worked, and I do not know why it doesn't want to work now. I'm sorry, participants, but I sort of, anyone?
Hi, Miss Braema. Can you click on the screen?
Sorry, that is what it is. Thank you so much. My apologies, everyone. So the outline of what I would be discussing would be primarily COVID-19 update, elections, Singapore general elections 2020, perspectives and observations, and Philippines upcoming elections, where I have some thoughts perhaps, but at the end of the day, I think what Prof. Dindo has shared, I think already some pertinent ground swell issues that people have raised. So the whole issue of having elections now would be there's a pandemic, which is a public health issue, and also a clinical issue once one is infected. And at the same time, elections, which is democracy, and it's a process that should ensure electoral processes happen in a free and fair manner. Synergizing public health with electoral process is the challenge that I think all countries are facing. But at the same time, as Prof. Dindo has expressed very clearly, it is also how long can one push away the elections? It is a citizen's right to vote. It is part of the democratic approach to have elections. Therefore, greater coming together after almost one full year of 2020, learning from many different countries, it is time to have an election process in a better and more tight more tightly controlled when it comes to public health where the COVID-19 virus is concerned. But Mr. Erik has already raised a very pertinent issue about cost. And perhaps it will come back again. The better off countries may be able to have a tighter marrying of the public health and an electoral process as compared to countries that are at various levels of development. So where then can one find those extra funds to ensure that there is no compromise on the public health, as well as to ensure that elections take place freely and fairly, and people are participating in the future of their own country, both health-wise as well as in the democratic process. So what is the global update on COVID-19? There are about 113, all these are coming from Worldometer, 13 million cases, 2.3 million deaths, and 88 million recoveries. In ASEAN, in the order of highest infection rates within ASEAN, Indonesia has the most, followed by Philippines, then Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, somewhere in the middle, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Brunei, Timor-Leste. I've put Timor-Leste in bracket because it is not yet officially an ASEAN member, and Laos, PDR. We also have to recognize that assessing one to be infected with COVID-19 is a process of whereby the person has declared that they are ill and they have entered some form of a testing program or some form of a medical facility. So we always have to be cognizant that these numbers are not totally the picture that we know. In Philippines, I just captured that. What is the land area? 7,641 islands of 300,000 square kilometers, population of 110 million, 564,000 COVID-19 cases, the number of deaths, and more importantly, it is 5,111 cases per 1 million people. 8.6 million tests have been done, which means 77,870 tests per 1 million of the population, Worldometer stats. Singapore, by comparison, land area is only 724 square kilometers, but we are one of the world's highest densely populated city. Yeah? Population 5.8. So I'm doing that as a comparison because the challenges of carrying out an electoral process is also demographics, is also polling centers, and how does it go downstream. But more importantly, in the Singapore data, the COVID tests that have been done, 7.2 million COVID tests, which comes up to 1,239 million tests per 1 million. That means we are doing more tests even above the 1 million. Some people are being tested twice, etc. So there's quite a disproportion here when it comes to COVID testing. Why is COVID testing very important? I will explain in a while. So now we come to public health. Over the whole of SARS, as well as the onslaught of COVID-19, we have learned how important preventive and protective equipment are, how our medical facilities are really meeting the needs of the people, but also at the same time, the inadequacy of the medical facilities, the rapid testing that is taking place, the access to testing, how downstream has it been? I think all these are important. And to what extent are people following the rules as well as in some cases legislation? Because many countries went into different levels of lockdown where if you are caught being in a crowded situation, then you will be arrested, you will be fined, etc. There's also a huge issue about rural populations versus urban, and what are the economics there? Can we expect a person living in a rural environment to have access, if the funds are not coming into their environment to boost the approach of accessibility. There are also vulnerable communities, those who are living in very crowded situations, slum conditions. In Singapore, most of it was among the migrant workers. Many of them were living in quite congested living quarters. So public health, we have learned, I think Prof. Dindo used the word, the whole of society for elections. But public health is also one of whole of society. It has to be multilateral, multi-sectoral, civil society, media, every community player, government, civil service officers, as well as vertical and horizontal. There are different levels of quality in all of these areas in terms of policy, in terms of implementation, and in terms of execution, to know where are the gaps and to plug the gaps. Therefore, the point I'm making here is land area. What are the current infrastructures and institutions that are already in place? What are the new public health provisions that have been put in place to handle COVID-19 and the existing electoral processes? So all these have to come together, collude to form an approach. And there are lessons to be learned from others. How do we make it better, and to maintain free and fair electoral process and to ensure that the approach is participatory. So here on elections, we have had different forms of elections, local, municipal, state, by-elections to national, and there have been referendums. Referendum has happened a few times in the country of Switzerland with the COVID-19. And the most important point, and I think the facilitator here is from the media, I think it's very important, clarity, information, communication, and different languages need to be used, infographics to help people understand the changes that they have to adhere to vote, to make sure their vote works and to keep themselves safe from being infected. So it is a participatory approach, but also a guidance in how one can do it better. The other part, I'm not going to go through, they are the usual election processes, polling, governance and accountability, which is of varying standards across the countries. There must be local watchfulness by civil society, by media, by social media, on reputable social media, online forums, fraudulence. We are dealing this time with severe claims of fraudulent elections in America that has divided the country, in Myanmar that has led to a takeover by the military, and in Belarus that led to street-wide long-term protests despite COVID-19. So that is the risk that we will face if processes are not well done and watchfulness and governance are compromised. I have put there a website of the IPU because most of this have also come from IPU. How do we conduct free and fair elections, right? And and this, I think Mr. Erik has already shared. It comes from IDEA. Their website is very useful. Many of the pointers that I have also gathered has come from IFES, as well as IDEA, as well as IPU and other INGOs, and some academic papers on what is going on, about how countries are responding in this merging of fulfilling public health issues as well as having free and fair electoral processes. So in Singapore, we have an elections department. It is within the Prime Minister's office, which many of us from civil society have asked for an independent commission to be set up, and we have failed. SOPs that were followed were WHO, and Mr. Erik has already raised a few things. Water, a basin for folks to wash hands is good. It's cheaper than having sanitizers, but it will become a stalling process, because if you have a huge population, people washing their hands before and after a vote will eat up into a lot of time. And that is why Singapore went by sanitizing route. We had more polling stations for the 2020 elections so that you spread out. And again, polling is only one day. So management of it all across the island has to be in one day. It starts and it ends. And therefore, for the first time in our history, we had to extend the polling period by 2 hours because the queue of people in Singapore, voting is mandatory. The queue of people was too long and it couldn't be closed. So something to learn from, to assess the quality of time, the number of centers, the different communities that will have to vote. How do we ensure that we put in procedures of gloves, the sanitizing, which all eat into time, and yet the polling can happen. We did disposable gloves, which, just to share that incident, means you have to put on your gloves on both palms, and when you finish, you got to put it into a bin. It ate up a lot of time. And so in some polling centers, the presiding officer stopped the whole issue of using disposable gloves and said, just use sanitizer pre-vote, after vote, sanitize your hands and off you go, right? Temperature taking is normal now. Everywhere we go, shopping mall, etc., office, there is a temperature thing. But what kind of instrument is the temperature scanner? The more sophisticated it is, for speedy temperature taking, that means more expensive. So these are considerations. The other part about stay home notices. In Singapore, those who were on home isolation, they had an opportunity in the polling period, slotted outside private time that they can come and drop their vote. Having said that, there are other country examples that show early voting, postal voting. A lot of the votes in America took place through postal voting, as well as a drive-in through drop-off of postal votes. Are these also further considerations? Because we stuck to the ballot in the box, which meant that time is eaten into just a one-day polling period. Should we have had 2 days? These are all considerations to learn from the Singapore example. But this is the other part, safety ambassadors. We had safety ambassadors following the different political parties and the supporters, and already there were rules on how many people can move together. The candidates were told you cannot knock on somebody's door beyond, I cannot remember the data, whether it is 2 persons or 3 persons. And the safety ambassadors were there to make sure that candidates as well as their supporters were following the rules that were set up by the election department, because this will be what will happen. The enthusiasm to get your seat in a campaign, while the polling can take place with better rules and governance, what about the campaign period? And the other part, what about the celebration period after you have been polled and your electoral results show that you are the winner? Or if you have defeated, you will make your rounds in the constituency to thank people. Then what happens to the crowding factor? I think we have to take care of that too. Overseas, Philippines, for example, has a number of Filipinos working overseas. We have a number of people overseas, but Singapore only opened 10 overseas centers in the embassies. None of the 10 ASEAN countries had a polling center, which was quite a paradox. But I think this is up to Philippines to map out, and how do we do the governance both for free and fair elections as well as public health. These are some of the challenges. Croatia, pardon, spelled wrongly, had 100 overseas centers for its people when it went to the polls. And oversights. These are some of the oversights from the Singapore experience. The gloves I've talked about, safe distancing, yes, but once you employ safe distancing. It is crucial. You have to give people the time to move from one spot. And if you are an older person, you can stand in line, keep distance, but it takes time for the person to move. Everything has to be factored. And electioneering, I've spoken about it, overcrowding. Social media can become an influencer both negatively or positively, which then means there could be crowd control issues, which is a law and order issue. And how does one want to marry that? By public health? And do we abuse the public health issue to say everything has to be law and order? I think all this becomes issues related to democracy. Good initiatives, legislation, so that one can have some special rules for the election of we had it for 2020. So what then would Philippines or any other country want, because it is an extraordinary new situation, right? And how many polling centers, archipelago, many islands. So all this have to be looked into. The other part I want to talk about is this, the high IT enability. We have high IT, we are all very clear. Therefore, it could actually even become an online electronic vote, but we didn't go there. But in a country like Philippines, to what extent will it be IT enabled so that you don't have all the distancing issues that one has to deal with? I think are going to be serious considerations when it comes to governance. Learning from other countries, often we forget Taiwan, maybe because of political reasons, but Taiwan has shown a very good example of having a successful election campaign as well as the whole process. As mentioned by Mr. Erik, South Korea, of course, Germany also has shown a good exemplary approach, as well as New Zealand. I'm only naming some. There are others, of course. But we also have to learn from mistakes or oversights done by other places. For example, Sabah, that had a by-election to choose the new chief minister, state election or by-election. Many people, politicians and supporters from mainland Malaysia flew over to Sabah to help for the party of interest. There was a lot of close contact, and many came back, and Malaysia went through the second wave of high incidences. There were already rules, there were already approaches, but political game and political campaigning, people will find it very difficult to follow the rules of what has already been in place. And in practice, it's no longer the month of January, February, or March. This is already mid-year. People are in shape for COVID, and yet many rules were flouted. Many came back, did not follow their quarantine processes, and therefore clusters happened in the community. And I've mentioned Belarus earlier and Myanmar. So learning from the remedial action so that we also learn from other countries. And France is a good example. It had its own local election. I forget now in my paper, I think it was March or April, found that the rates of incidents were going up. They stopped the next election that ought to have taken place, waited for it to be abated, going into the phase out of the COVID infections before they had what was needed, part 2 of the elections. That I call good remedial action taken up by the government, right? And what is the future? What will be the future for Philippines? For example, postal votes, drive-in, electronic, all these are serious considerations. And most importantly, the last point that I put right at the top of the previous slide, people's education. To make them understand how polling takes place, campaigning, you are part and parcel. We are trying to observe each other's citizenry rights, but also each other's public health. Yeah. And therefore, for Philippines, my last slide, I think there are already many things in place when it comes to public health, but because Philippines is a large archipelago, what about the transport systems? What about the boats? What about all this to get people to polling centers? I think are huge considerations. And on the spot non-compliance, this is an issue. This was an issue in Singapore. Safety ambassadors, in the early months, people retaliated against the safety ambassador, trying to tell them, put on your mask, otherwise I'm going to fine you. There was retaliation. But after a while, it evened out. This has isolated incidences. But in a country where perhaps there is a higher levels of freedom, etc., then what would one do, and how to get this person to comply with when a person flouts the safety procedures when it comes to COVID-19. It is an important point, I think, to consider. Electoral systems, I've talked about it. On staff, which I want to share, it is very important that polling agents, counting agents, the whole process of the electoral system, even administrators, everyone needs to go through every election, people go through a training, but right now it is two parts. It has to cover the public health and in compliance and enforcing. No point having everything in print if then nobody observes it on the ground. Therefore, I think that is quite an important training that needs to take place. Further attention on vulnerable communities, living in crowded situations, people with disabilities, rural versus urban. I think all these, and overseas centers, as I've mentioned before. So sorry, I was abrupt there. My apologies in ending. So that is more or less what I have. And going back to this, I just wanted to share that in my paper that I've given at the bottom, I have expanded on some country examples, but it was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was a July paper. Therefore, I think more things have happened since then. So thank you very much for your time. Very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Braema Mathi, for that very detailed discussion, especially the set of recommendations you put forth, which can be adopted in the Philippines, of course, using the context here in the Philippines, as mentioned by Erik Asplund earlier in this discussion. Now, for our third guest speaker, we'd like to introduce our third speaker now. He's the Senior Resident Director for Elections and Civil Society Development with the Afghanistan Office of the National Democratic Institute. He's also a co-founder of the newly formed Democratic Insights Group, which focuses on electoral competitiveness and voter-centered elections. Since 2004, he has served with the NDI in various capacities, including as resident director in Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea, and elections director in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Indonesia, and Bougainville. He continues to be involved in work on electoral integrity, technology in elections, international domestic election observation, democratic reform, and civil society capacity building. He served with the National Citizens Movement for Free Elections, or NAMFREL, from 1986 to 2017, serving as its National Executive Director from 1997 until 2003, and a member of the National Council from 2009 until 2017. He holds an MBA from the Asian Institute of Management and is a fellow at the Institute of Corporate Directors. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Mr. Telibert Laoc.
Thank you very much, Mr. Esguerra, and good morning, everyone. As a reactor to the panelists before me, I will take the opportunity to contextualize their inputs in the Philippine setting. I will also offer ideas on strategic and operational guidelines for the outputs envisioned by Project Participate. I will also offer tasks where civil society organizations doing nonpartisan election observation work may put some effort on. I don't have a slide presentation, but I think I can use a video as I speak. I'll wait for the tech guys to put me on video. But in the meantime, to the Ateneo School of Government and members of Project Participate, thanks for having me. Thanks for the privilege to input in your work to inform and engage key electoral stakeholders so that they could help ensure safe and credible elections. It is also my privilege to be speaking alongside Ms. Braema Mathi and Mr. Erik Asplund. The study and findings of International IDEA and the Singaporean elections last year are, of course, instructive. On postponing or holding elections, depending on the country's legal framework, elections could be easy or difficult to postpone. In the Philippines, while postponing elections is technically possible under Section 5 of the Omnibus Election Code, that would mean extension of the terms of office of current officials on a holdover capacity, which is not in law. Of all the issues around the elections, postponement or talk about it would be the most contentious, because it would open the Constitution for amendments, not just to provide mechanisms to postpone elections, but also on the jealously guarded economy and patrimony and others. On turnout, from the 10 elections since 1992 up to the most recent in 2019, the Philippines registered a steady average turnout of 76%. There is a small uptick of 2 percentage points if elections are for president, such as the one coming up in 2022. This high and consistent turnout is attributed to the fact that election day is a holiday and that voters cast their ballots for all national and local officials on this single day. The synchronized polls contribute to the festive campaign atmosphere that many believe also encourages turnout. However, if the turnout is going to be maintained, there will be a need for tactical special voting arrangements, some akin to those mentioned earlier and those adopted in Singapore. On health and safety, we expect that by the time of the elections in early May next year, there will be a considerable number of individuals who have opted to be vaccinated. They might be easier persuaded to go out and vote. However, this would add a new classification of voters and polling officials, that is, those who are vaccinated and those who are not, and could possibly stratify and complicate the thinking around the administration of the election and implementation of special voting arrangements. On special voting arrangements, there are processes not initially designed for COVID, but could be used and expanded. The local absentee advance voting already in practice for polling officials who are away from their designated polling stations to be able to vote in the place where they are serving as polling staff. This could be expanded to senior citizens and to those 21 years old and under. Both cohorts, as we know, are classified as vulnerable to COVID, and their movement has been restricted under quarantine rules. The concept similar to mobile polling station is also already in place in voting in prison facilities for persons deprived of liberty. The concept of the ballot coming to the voter instead of the voter going to the ballot could be expanded to include perhaps those who are vulnerable and not vaccinated. I would call them the new marginalized, but they want to vote. On campaign limitations, limits to campaigning like those reported by International IDEA and practiced in the Singapore elections are very much the same protocols that are now too familiar to us. These are limits to the number of people in outdoor and indoor gatherings, donning of protective equipment, distancing, availability of sanitizers, and others. The IDEA paper pointed to some report that many limitations and health and safety protocols were not being respected nor enforced. We expect that this could also be the case a year from now. Perhaps candidates would even have themselves purposely vaccinated so that they could shake hands, converse up close, or take selfies, all to make that sought-after connection with voters. On financing elections, the cost of administering elections could rise owing to expenditures, as already mentioned by the speakers before me. But similar to Singapore, another is for additional polling staff in order to open more polling stations to bring down the current number of voters per cluster precinct and decongest polling centers and minimizing queuing. Obviously, there are incremental costs owing to COVID, and I think 9-10% is probably a good number to consider and work around. But all these are introductory to what I want to emphasize here. I think it is important to clearly articulate the challenge statement for the elections in 2022. Framing the mission or the challenge like, how might we redefine the election processes, especially voting, to keep it credible and make it safe for voters, polling officials, candidates, and election administrators? This is probably a good starting point. The we in the challenge statement is not just for the election management body, which is the Commission on Elections, but also civil society and everyone else helping in the elections. Having framed the challenge statement, the next step is to define the parameters within which to address the challenge by setting specific goals. For example, one goal could be to keep the same level of turnout, maintain the 76% or 78% in presidential elections. The other goal, and is complementary, is for voters to feel that they receive enough information about the candidates. Another complementary goal is for candidates to feel that they're able to connect with voters despite not being able to campaign in person. For voters and polling officials to feel safe. And lastly, for COMELEC and government personnel administering and supporting the elections to also feel safe. You will note that the crafting of the goals is governed by principles of human-centered design or design thinking. The next step would have to be listening exercises. The human-centered design or design thinking, the center or the heart of the design or redesign process is, of course, the user or the client. The next step would then have to be listening exercises. These could be done through surveys or through focus group discussions. The purpose is to find out, for example, what would it take to make voters feel that they are indeed receiving enough information about the different candidates. The other question to ask voters is, what would it take for them to be convinced to go out and vote on election day? The same exercises would be done with polling officials and COMELEC personnel. A similar exercise would be targeted to candidates, asking what would it take to make them feel safe if they could campaign in person, and how they think they could effectively connect and know that they have indeed made a connection with voters, say via social media or other non-in-person means. Then the solution formulation could begin in earnest. In this process, I would use the limitations imposed by COVID as a case to improve on voter-centeredness and efficiency in the delivery and execution of the elections. The key step here is to review the current processes, such as the voting and counting of votes by machine, and incorporating the feedback from the users towards the redesign. This is where adoption of proven and secure technology could be considered to make processes more efficient. Online processes could be used to administer in part or in full the registration of voters, locating or providing directions to polling stations, the filing of candidacies, submissions of statements of contributions and expenses by candidates and others. All that said, I think the work is essentially cut out for civil society organizations that are observing elections, like NAMPREL, which is a member of Project Participate, and LENTE, the Legal Network for Transparent Elections. They could certainly contribute by organizing listening exercises and participating in the solution formulation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that reaction, Mr. Laoc. Now, at this point, we'd like to open the floor for questions to our panelists. There's a first question coming from Professor Ed Naco. I'd like to read this for our panelists. She said that as our own Philippine Commission on Elections admitted, budget allocation for electoral exercises is always hardly a priority, and especially so now when election costs are competing with public health and social development projects. If COMELEC is limited in its financial resources to respond to devices or protective equipment for health and safety measures, how might citizens be encouraged to participate in an election with consideration to health and safety? How do or did citizens in other countries, enhance people's participation in the electoral exercise? What might be the biggest role of civil society in this context? I guess perhaps Ms. Braema would like to
Yeah.
address this question. Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. I forgot the name of the person who asked the question. I think
Edna Ko, Professor Edna Ko.
Oh, thank you. It's a fundamental question because I think Erik had shared the astronomical rise in costs to to care about people's health as well as the governance on the electoral process. For us in Singapore, it is a tight situation in terms of security, and we have never had a case of fraudulent election. Uh, and we are lucky that we don't have the huge issue of corruption. So I think these are going to be the challenges that I think need to be addressed. So where to get funds? I think Philippines is quite open, although I know President Duterte is now making some ventures with his suggestion that funds from other foreign countries he needs certain levels of I think there are some restrictions he was talking about that can be a problem. But MARUAH, the civil society that I belong to, we are a member of ENFREL. One of the EXCO members or the founder of ENFREL is a Filipino Professor Waldo, I believe. And I think, and becoming members of international organizations that work towards free and fair elections will be good. It could become that as a partner, one can access some funds. The public health side to be part of an international framework where civil societies are concerned to take care of this, to prevent the rise in COVID-19 infections, as well as other infectious diseases that can be prevalent depending on the community that one comes from. I think those are some access routes. And I think alternatives must be provided to the government that we limit the compromises on public health as well as on the electoral process that ought to take place. The last point I would like to make on that question is that plenty of the work in governance and watchfulness and accountability often sadly comes from well-minded, good-meaning volunteers. And I think I would work towards building up a huge pool of volunteers and get the training done so that we increase the levels of accountability when it comes. I think Mr. Telibert has made it very plain how things can just go overboard once it comes to campaigning, not the polling, the campaigning, which is also very problematic. Yeah, thank you. This is what I think I can share. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that response, Ms. Braema. Another question coming from Annalisa Munoz. Considering the safety of the voters and even the watchers or other personnel in the polling center, would it be possible to utilize a mobile application so that the voters won't have to go to polling centers? All they need is a mobile phone and an internet connection, of course. Actually, we are a team of developing, or a team involved in developing a mobile application, and this is one I think they are considering. Who would like to respond to this?
Okay, I will just attempt, and I hope the other panelists will join in. You see, for the COVID-19, many of us have started doing what we call crowd social contact. We have used appliances to see what's the level of social contact.
Braema, I think you got muted.
Realize that, okay, I have to say it again. I feel that for COVID-19 and finding out the social context, many of us have, many countries have introduced various forms of mobile applications. If one can look at those applications that doesn't intrude into the privacy of the person, has some levels of security and is cost effective, one can really try and start the pilot runs on some of the surveys example that people want to run, and then ramp it up to see whether it could be a national approach. Still, I cannot account for how one is going to govern issues related to double accounting when it comes to polls, etc. But COVID-19 has put forward a lot of applications. I think we can tap into that. That is what I'm trying to say here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Braema. I have a question. I think this can also serve as a good segue for the next question, which was sent to our Q&A box. I think the Philippines in particular is dealing with two crises going into next year's elections. Number one, of course, is the health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. But we're also going to face what can be considered as an epidemic of disinformation, which you also saw in 2019, which we also saw in 2016. Now, I'd like to ask our resource speakers here, based on lessons coming, for instance, from other countries that conducted elections during the pandemic, what lessons can we draw from those experiences and apply here in the Philippines? Of course, given the context of the Philippines having been described as patient zero in terms of disinformation. Erik, Mr. Erik Asplund, would you like to respond to that? Or anyone?
Okay, I will try. I do not know whether it's a foolproof thingy or whatever. You see, I think even if we just, because there's a lot of sensitivity to such a discussion, but Halalan, is that how I pronounce it? Sorry, I think there's an opportunity here, but include more government officers to discuss maybe lessons one could have learned from other country examples. I have shared quite distinctly the example of the Sabah state elections. It has been written up in the news media, everything. Therefore, there are lessons to be drawn from that, which primarily was the political parties, their supporters, who went overboard in focusing on the political campaign and not minding so much the public health side of it. So that those could be examples that one could take to the platform of political parties and say, here's the, nobody likes the word capacity building if they are veterans, but maybe to say you are part of the stakeholder community, to say that this is what has happened and we can't afford to put so much stress on the medical facilities with people coming down with COVID infections. That is one example that I can share. But beyond that, I think right now it is a difficult terrain for Philippines to navigate, I would say, because I think how to normalize for free and fair elections is the challenge amidst the COVID-19. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, again, we're encouraging our participants to send their questions to our Q&A box. I think a related question regarding the one I just asked is that, of course, during the pandemic, the campaign is expected to shift heavily online through social media. Now, is there any template of sorts that can be used here in the Philippines coming from other countries in terms of, let's say, helping properly regulate campaign spending online? In such a way that somehow we can still level the playing field without providing too much advantages to those moneyed candidates. Erik.
Thank you, Christian. Let me just respond a little bit to the last question that you had. And hello, everyone, by the way. It's great to join you all the way from Stockholm. Sorry I couldn't join you in person earlier. So let me just say a little bit about this information. I think one interesting case that we should all can learn from is the United States of America, of course, especially in terms of the social media, the accusations of fraud, the lack of regulation, really, and during the time, and also the fact, and which made it even more difficult in the case of the US because their election commissions are decentralized, right? Because one of the key aspects in terms of is obviously codes of conduct, right? So the political parties have a code of conduct, but in the case of disinformation in the US, that was very difficult to control, right? So moving forward to this question on campaigning, I think this is extremely important. We looked into campaigning in 51 countries as part of a study that we did, and what is quite obvious is the fact that public gatherings are being limited, right? So in certain countries, you're allowed to gather no more than 20 people. In some countries, it's 50 people, right? In other countries, you might see a combination of public gatherings being limited, but also that campaigns are banned, right? Public rallies or physical campaigns are banned. And as a result, as you rightly said, a lot of these campaigns are now going online, right? Where it's quite difficult to see what's happening and what people are actually saying. I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion at the moment in terms of, you know, how an EMB can actually, you know, have some kind of, or an election observation group can actually have some insight into what discussions are being had. But what is interesting is that political parties are spending huge amounts of money now on social media, and that is something which is difficult also to, you know, to have an insight in terms of how much money they're spending.
I think Mr. Laoc would like to respond to that same question, but I'd also like to read this question addressed to you, Mr. Laoc. You can answer this right after you respond to the first question. Is it solely the elections agency's responsibility to make sure that voters get enough information about the elections and candidates? How do you think should educational institutions participate in this aspect of election dynamics?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the questions. I'll go up to Dr. Ko's first question. So I did a little bit of study on what measures interviewing polling officials from the 2019 elections. These are those at the polling stations, and asked them what it would take for them to serve again. If you look at their mindset isn't really very complicated. We are at the time of the interview, they're familiar with the protocols that one will have to take himself or herself. Never mind the others, let's say the state. So barriers, not too many of those barriers are considered in the polling station. And then there is a onus on each one to spend for their own masks, face shield, and buy their own sanitizers. That one they're already able to do. So if you look at in depth the incremental cost, it might not be that much. What is important though is to decongest the polling stations so that voters feel that they are safe. And there's a cost to that, but I don't think it is so much, because what we know from the COMELEC, also as a product of that interview, was that many of the schools are not really using all the classrooms in order for them to serve as polling stations. So there are available facilities there. And really the issue there is to decongest. On the question of Mr. Ignacio, certainly not that it is the COMELEC's sole responsibility to inform voters about candidates. No, certainly not. I think civil society and even educational institutions, and I'm taking off from your question, can offer information to the public about the local candidates, the profiles of the candidates, their record of service if they have been government officials before. And these are already credentialed sources right away. If your local school or university opens a platform for people to check and learn about their candidates right away, that is credible at the get-go. And imagine if that will be done throughout the country, then you're actually also addressing fake news at the same time, because you're actually pointing people two sources that are credible.
Here's a question for Mr. Asplund. Does International IDEA have data on the extent of the spread of misinformation or perhaps even disinformation during elections? Do you have projects or advocacies addressing these issues?
I think it's a project that we're working on, but we at the moment we don't have any data as such on this particular topic. Thank you.
There's a question addressed to Ms. Mathi. Singapore recently enacted an anti-fake news law, which has been criticized for undermining free speech. Of course, here in the Philippines, we have the anti-terrorism law, which was recently passed and, of course, heavily criticized by human rights groups. I don't think only human rights groups are criticizing this. The criticisms come across different sectors in society. Now, the question is, how did this anti-fake news law affect electoral campaigns in Singapore? What should the Commission on Elections and Filipino citizens do to protect free speech and strengthen electoral integrity?
I think that's a good question. POFMA, it is called, and we keep using the word POFMA till I've forgotten what it stands for, but it is all about manipulation of information and falsehoods. It was used during the election campaign on some of the opposition candidates, and the trials are ongoing. So to what you also said, Mr. Christian, I don't know, I'm trying to think how to say it. You see, security by public health and security by information channels, both are going to come and impact on any election. And in this case, both of these streams are going to be severely scrutinized by usually the ruling party, because everyone has a stake, as well as the parties that are opposing. So I just want to tie up a little bit to the previous question, if that's okay. I think it is crucial. I put that as bullet number 2, I think, not that it's so well thought through by prioritization in my PowerPoint slides, but I think I put it right at the top that communication and information channels are crucial across board on both fronts of COVID-19, as well as changes in electoral processes, and including all the political parties some of whom will be reluctant to know what to follow, because they are more focused on their campaigning. So on this, a law is useful, but we have found, POFMA, many of us have said, the law that the questioner asked, we have found it to be too restrictive. So that is what I can say. Yeah.
Okay, here's another question from Mr. Francisco Silvidad. What are the measures we can do to improve voters' education and impede vote buying? Quite difficult, honestly, especially in the Philippine context. Who would like to respond? Perhaps Mr. Laoc, would you like to respond to this?
Sure. I point to the paper of Dr. Ronald Mendoza. He is the Dean of the Ateneo School of Government, and on his study on vote buying. And it's revealing that while it is sort of known that it's a transactional thing, but there are, based on his study, there are reasons, there are really instances where voters are really thinking about who they want to vote for, despite the fact that they have received financial offers or assistance from others. So I think I would say that in this case, that will probably stay for a bit, as long as there are people who are underserved and look at money as a way to relieve themselves from some of the things that they're suffering from. I think the other way to look at it is on the cost of getting elected. The question earlier about social media, I think, is important to recognize that while there might be spends going towards social media as opposed to traditional media, perhaps, the beauty, I think, or the advantage of spending on social media is, I think, there is full accounting of the cost. Receipts are official and all that kind of stuff. And that helps us understand what's the cost of getting elected. Philippine phenomenon, for those who might not be informed as much, there are funders for candidates. If you want to run, or there's a chance for you to win, you could look for a funder, and that guy or that person will take care of your election or financing your election. I think the way to really do this is on a structural level. If the cost of getting elected is very high, then there's likely to that kind of dynamics. And if people, I think, are getting good information about the candidates, perhaps the need to transact with the candidate or to wait for the candidate to sway how they will vote, perhaps using money and other means, will be diminished. But I think this will stay with us for some time.
Okay, Mr. Laoc, I just want to take off from that response of yours. Of course, it's important to educate the public, to provide them with credible information, to help them make the right choice on election day. But of course, you know the realities, right? The patronage politics, the extent of which is very much felt all over the Philippines. But I'd like to frame this question at least on a positive note. Did you see any encouraging signs, for instance, in 2019 or 2016, for instance, that could somehow point to a certain shift in terms of mindset coming from a specific segment of the voting population that could actually make a big difference in 2022 in terms of turning away from this kind of mentality?
Not directly to answer your question, Christian, but I did a short paper on unopposed candidacies. These are races where there's only one candidate running. And what I have found out is that there are less voters voting for positions that are uncontested. And I look at it as a signal from the voter. You don't give me a choice, I will not bother voting. And I take off from there, looking at how voters are also thinking. I think actually a really difficult question to answer. So perhaps an iteration, I would say, in the discussion, and I would say that as long as not having competitive elections, that candidates are the ones that are having economic control, as opposed to people who are qualified because they just know how to govern and they have the right education, then we'll probably have to face this issue for some time.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's another question. I think Mr. Asplund can respond to this. Based on the experience in other countries, people perceive that poor record in combating COVID-19 might deter voters to come out and participate in the elections. Now, what other measures should be taken to instill confidence among voters that the 2022 elections in the Philippines would be safe?
Right. Thank you very much. We have been looking at voter turnout for 2020 elections, and I think we'll continue looking at voter turnout for 2021 elections. What we've seen in general is that voter turnout has decreased in a lot of countries that have had general elections, also subnational elections. We have also seen countries where voter turnout has increased. Now, that may be due to various factors. Civic duty is one. The political context is another. Also, the timing of elections could be a factor. But I think to some extent, going back to the last question, I just wanted to mention one thing, was the fact there was a question on civic education. And I forgot to mention, or disinformation or misinformation. I think I mentioned regulation, but also the fact that civic education is extremely important. Now, what is sometimes difficult to see is who has, that mandate. And sometimes it's very clear in the country. In other cases, it's not. So you might see an election commission, which is actually the custodian of democracy, who's taken that role, right? And who's actually doing a lot of electoral education, because it's kind of not missing it within the Ministry of Education. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Okay. By the way, the participants, you're still encouraged to send your questions to the Q&A box. But I'd like to ask this question. Either Braema or Erik can respond to this. In terms of your monitoring of elections that were held during the pandemic in other countries, what particular vulnerabilities did you notice in terms of candidates actually taking advantage of the pandemic situation? In terms of perhaps controlling the narrative, controlling the messaging, taking advantage of, let's say, the COVID-19 protocols to make sure that perhaps a segment of the population which they thought would not vote for them would be suppressed further, meaning disenfranchised.
Yeah, maybe I can just say a few words about that. I mean, to some extent, governments have been able to control the narrative in the sense that they're able to discuss COVID-19 pretty much, and the measures that they're taking to limit COVID-19. And as a result, these figures, it could be, the leading politicians in the country, for example, are making use of, the public platform to talk about, their measures. And we have seen some examples of snap elections being held as a result, because politicians can see that according to opinion polls, they would do very well. So it is interesting to see, to some extent, how COVID is pretty much the main thing people are talking about in this political sphere at the moment.
Yeah, I just would like, if I may, I would like to respond to that point, question that I've raised, and also answer something that has come in the chat question on Philippines, whether the 2022 elections can be postponed and connected to Singapore. Singapore ought to have had the election that it had last year by April 2021. And when it first decided by passing a law to say that we are going to have the election at that time, June, there was much consternation from a number of parties. Why now? And many had also said that, is it because COVID-19, there is a fear element amongst the people, and therefore it is a good time. It's related to political estimation from the ruling party as to when you want to have your election. And many argued, and it also became a parliamentary discussion, why must we have it now? Why can't we have it later? In another 2 months is April 2021. And for preparing for this, I was thinking, what if we were to have our elections next month in March, when vaccinations have already come in a big way into Singapore? So the other side of the question to COVID-19 would be this rush to get people vaccinated, to give some level of assurance by the government and other political parties to say we have taken care of you. And what is our definition today of corruption? Is it only a transaction by money? Or is it also a transaction of, if you vote me in, then for your community, I will provide A, B, C, D. So there's a transaction that is taking place within the political campaigns that I think the counterfoil group is good, social media. But as Erik has pointed out, how are people, what is their critical analysis where we are being our exposure is too much information is coming. What's the critical analysis? And I think the example of America that I said earlier, and I think Erik also mentioned it, how did Trump control the whole thing just by a Twitter? And now the country, you talk to them, no, it went to court, everything, it is not a fraudulent election, and yet people are sticking to it. So how information gets into the essence of your being and your loyalty, I think is the new way in which many of the political campaigns are going to run. And I think citizens have to be very well educated. I think I would put more money into education of citizens. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that response. Okay, I think we're down to our last question. Since we're running out of time, perhaps this could help end this part of the forum on a positive note. The question is, what can the Filipino youth do to ensure the safe conduct of elections and maximize participation in the electoral process? Okay, anybody? Erik, would you like to respond?
Okay,
Telibert?
I will.
Well,
Braema?
Okay.
Okay, okay, go. Erik, go ahead.
I guess it really it's very depends on the context and very much on the Filipino youth. I know in many countries there has been a need for more people to help run elections. And I think in Nigeria, for example, they have volunteers that help the election commission on E-Day, right? So working as polling station officials or helping polling station officials. Now, what has been interesting to see, and I think that I mentioned it during my presentation, is to what extent health and safety measures are held during elections, and so there's definitely a need for more people, and this could maybe be younger people as well, to help with election administration on election day. Another thing that I think would be very important to mention is the fact that more people that typically work as election officials may not want to work as election officials at the moment because they're considered to be vulnerable, right? Because they are in a risk group. So many election commissions are now going out with public campaigns, basically asking more people to become a polling official. Now, I think if this would be something, a temporary election worker, for example, I think that would be fantastic if more people were able to apply for that kind of role moving forward, and even in the Philippines.
Yeah,
Thank you, Erik. Now, to end this Q&A portion, I'd like to ask for a short messages coming from our two other panelists. We'll start with Braema and then Mr. Laoc.
I really think Philippines, I looked at some data, you still have a very high score, higher than Singapore on some data that I forgot to write down, 5.75 actually on the scale of political, and Singapore is 5.32. So I do think when it comes to democracy and political structuring and mechanisms, Philippines has got quite a lot of good things with it that it can work to its advantage. And I feel that the biggest thing that you asked towards the end, I really have to say the youths are crucial. I think they can be great monitors within the civil society of everything that is going right, praise it, and everything that's not going right. They can give you spontaneous and fast with the social media, quick accounting on what is happening on the ground. I think they are crucial to the whole process as the third party, civil society, as media, and within the mechanism of running an election, polling agents, etc. Crucial group. And women. I think a lot of women who are doing a lot of good in Philippines will rise to the front again, because I know that the women in Philippines are very strong in this area. So that is what I'm saying, without prejudice, that is, yeah.
Mr. Lao.
Thank you again for having me. I think I'll end with a note on response to the question on the youth. I think it's important to get yourselves talking and let your voices be heard. Many of you are digital natives, tech savvy, and I think that's the future of representation or elections and accounting of performance of officials moving forward. You'll have to express what you think you would like to see elections moving forward. It might not be realized in the 2022 elections, but I'd like you to be patient and move along with it, and use your influence, your future voter, a big cohort going into the electoral exercise, and try to change the processes, making sure that it becomes responsive to the voter, that procedures are serving the voter, and encouraging not just voter participation, but participation of all others, especially in becoming candidates, and that kind of sort. So it's a deposit of sorts that you probably will reap after an iteration of a few elections.
Okay, thank you very much for that short message. And that ends our discussion with our guest speakers. Now, if you have further questions, you may send in your questions via email at participate.asog or asog@ateneo.edu. We thank our speakers for extending their knowledge and expertise to discuss a highly significant democratic process at a time of crisis. Now, to wrap up our event, may we call on the director of the De La Salle University Institute of Governance, Dr. Ador Torneo, to give his closing remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you very much to our speakers. So, how can civil society organizations promote an inclusive and meaningful electoral process during the coronavirus pandemic? This afternoon, our esteemed resource speakers answer this question and examine the role that civil society organizations and other stakeholders played in ensuring political participation and improving the quality of elections in Singapore and a few other countries. What they shared inspired and give us hope that if they can do it in Singapore and 83 other countries that have held national elections, then we can learn from them and succeed in the Philippines as well. I would like to highlight some of my key takeaways. The first is the need for civil society to take an active role, raise awareness, and be engaged in the elections to ensure that no voters are disenfranchised and that obstacles and challenges do not particularly disadvantage groups, especially those who are vulnerable and at risk. The second is the importance of allocating enough resources and coming up with creative and innovative mechanisms to ensure participation, protect the health, manage risks, and allay concerns of voters who might otherwise be discouraged from participating in the elections. This will entail additional cost, but is a necessary investment. The third is finally, successful elections do not just happen, especially in a pandemic situation. It is also not a task that can be left to an agency such as the Commission on Elections alone. There are policy, logistical, informational, and even social and psychological challenges, fear that need to be managed. These require careful preparations and involvement from different stakeholders who can contribute to ensure that each stage of the process, from registration to candidate filing to discussion of issues in election proper and even post-election, will pose minimal risk to public health, elicit as much participation as is practicable, are fair and honest, credible, to ensure that the legitimacy of the elections will never be in question. On behalf of the organizing committee, Project Participate, and the Ateneo School of Government and its partners, the La Salle Institute of Governance, Ideas Incorporated, Code NGO, and our co-presenters, Strat-Based ADR Institute and Democracy Watch, I would like to thank all of you for being here and participating in this webinar. I would especially like to thank our speakers for today, MARUAH Singapore Secretary Braema Mathi, International IDEA Program Officer Erik Asplund, and National Democratic Institute Elections and Civil Society Development Resident Senior Director Telibert Laoc. Of course, Professor Dino Manhit, who gave an excellent opening remarks, and our moderator, Mr. Christian Esguerra, for the wonderful discussion this afternoon. We hope that the discussions has been fruitful and relevant, and all of us will leave this webinar with useful insights and ideas for future activities and engagements. We also hope that this will pave the way for collaboration between and among us, the election stakeholders. This is only the second webinar of this series. We still have a next event titled Elections Under COVID-19, COVID-Proofing the 2022 Elections Manual Turnover on March 5th at 1 p.m. And we hope to see all of you there. Thank you very much. Good afternoon and mabuhay.
Thank you, Dr. Torneo, and of course, all our speakers this afternoon. At this point, may we invite all our speakers to stay for a quick photo opportunity before we end today's session. Okay, who's going to take the picture?
Hi everyone, please turn on your cameras. I'll be taking the picture.
Okay.
All right, so let me just count. 1, 2, 3. All right, thank you.
Okay. And that ends the third session of Halalan 2.0, holding free, fair, and safe elections under the new normal. We invite everyone to join Halalan 2.0's culminating event to be announced soon via our social media pages, where the Ateneo School of Government shall present the research on COVID-proofing the 2022 elections here in the Philippines. Now tell us what you think about today's webinar and what you hope to learn in our succeeding sessions by leaving a comment on our Facebook live stream or tweeting about the event using the hashtags Let's Vote In and COVID-Free Halalan Webinar Series. For more updates, you may visit the Ateneo School of Government and Project Participates' social media pages. Thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you very much for joining us in this webinar.